How's it going, crypto community? In this video, we're going to be listening to Brad Garlinghouse speak with Ross Leckow from the IMF. This is a little bit older panel, but these two have just some awesome chemistry, and I think it would be really good for a lot of newer investors in the community to understand how strong the relationship between Ripple and the IMF has become. Now, real quick, before we do hop into this, and as many of you can see on the screen, also this is a 34-minute video, so obviously I'm going to probably split this up into at least 2 videos for you. So look forward to this as a deep dive series, right? Now, for all of you who are new, be sure to hit that subscribe button so that you can be and ring that bell so you can be informed when part 2 of this is going to be made available to you. Also, if you enjoy content like this, make sure you hit that like so that I know that you want more of this, right? Now, let's hop straight into this video. I'm going to stop jabbering and we're going to listen to Ross begin by introducing what they're here to talk about.
Pleasure to welcome you all here this afternoon to this discussion of blockchain and banks, particularly the application and the potential for blockchain technologies in the ASEAN region. As was just said, my name is Ross Leckow. I'm Deputy General Counsel of the IMF. And I should explain, I think as some of you know, that the IMF is an international organization based in Washington, D.C., whose membership consists of the governments of 189 different countries, almost every country in the world. And our mandate is to promote the stability and effective operation of the international monetary system and the global financial system. And I think for this reason, our interest in fintech should be fairly obvious.
So let's be clear what he just said, to summarize. Also, because there was kind of some background feedback from the audience and some random person in the background that is apparently too close to a mic, right? But to his overall point, he just explained that the IMF is essentially a regulatory institution with the sole purpose of fostering stability and the healthy growth of the global economy, right? And so it's for that reason, it should be obvious, as he said, why they're taking an interest in fintech. Specifically, the fintech company that he's sitting on a stage with, right? Via their CEO, Brad Garlinghouse. What do you have to say to us, Brad?
Well, as was introduced, my name is Brad Garlinghouse. I have the good fortune of being the CEO at Ripple. For those of you not familiar with Ripple sells a set of technologies to banks and other financial institutions that dramatically accelerate the ability for banks and regulated financial institutions to settle transactions between each other. We have a series of products ranging from fiat to fiat transactions, also transactions leveraging digital assets. Native to our tech stack is a digital asset called XRP that we allow banks to eliminate the need for pre-funding. I should point out that from our point of view, the challenge that many different markets, certainly true in ASEAN as well, is how do we take transactions that today might take a wire transaction from Singapore to Bangkok, days to settle, and the expense would be quite high. How do we reduce the friction as measured by speed and time and transparency and dramatically improve that? By doing that, we think we can dramatically change a lot of different factors, some of which we will talk about today. So a couple things that are unique about this format. I'm actually interviewing Ross, and he's interviewing me. So we're both moderators. Also, we are going to leave time at the end for audience questions. So to the extent you have not used Pigeonhole, encourage you to try that out. And we'll put questions up on the screen that we'll take with the last 10 minutes or so. All right, so with that opening, Ross, tell us, what does fintech mean to the IMF, and what is the IMF's interest in it?
Thank you, Brad. First of all, I should say that the IMF is devoting a lot of attention to fintech, and in particular blockchain. But we think that it's difficult to talk about blockchain without considering it in the light of the other new technologies that are forming part of the fintech debate. And we include a lot of different technologies in this space, within this concept, including, of course, the internet and cloud computing, distributed ledgers and blockchain, of course, and the crypto assets that are associated with them, big data and artificial intelligence, biometric data, application program interfaces, and of course, mobile phone technology. And, you know, our 189 member countries, or many of them, are coming to the IMF for advice, given their interest in these issues, looking for guidance as to how to approach and unlock the potential of fintech, while at the same time putting in place regulation that guards against the risks.
So, I'm not going to talk too much over Brad's parts because what's more important from this debate, or this discussion rather, for me, is to break down for you what Ross is saying, right? Because it's more important for you as an investor in XRP to know what XRP's partners or friendly alliances, you know, if you don't want to use the big P in regards to Ripple and the IMF, but it's more important for you to understand how these associates of Ripple feel about Ripple, more so than how Ripple feels about Ripple, right? It's like, you know, say you know somebody, not giving any examples or anything, but, you know, perhaps you know somebody who's really successful, right? They have a lot of money. That's successful, right? That's why you get this image of them being successful. And so this person has a lot of money, and so you say they're successful. They must, you know, your automatic thought is they must have their stuff together, right? Well, then you get to know that person. You have the honor to get to know that person, and you find out that all they can do is talk about themselves. They don't talk about anybody but themselves. And it's always good. It's always the best. They're the best. They're the best. You know, they've done so much, right? Well, you know, you could take that person at their word and hope, beyond hope, that they're being honest with you. But more often than not, you know, it's better to get a second opinion, right? And so that's what we do when you look at these groups that are associating with that person and doing business with that person, right? How's that person making money? Well, they're through their partners. Well, how do their partners feel about doing business with them? Are they happy with the service they're receiving? Yes? Interesting. Now, I got a little bit off topic, but the idea is to explain why I'm only going to be addressing Ross here. And now, what Ross just went on to explain in his the little bit that he did right here before we paused is that banks and governments are coming to Ripple the banks and financial institutions and governments are coming to the IMF seeking help and guidance on how to regulate crypto and not crypto, he uses the term fintech, and he explained what all is included in fintech, but first and foremost on everybody's mind, as should be, especially since he's on stage with, you know, Brad Garlinghouse, and this panel is named Blockchain and Banks. The fintech in question is blockchain, right? Don't let all of his terminology obfuscate you from the, cloud your vision instead of obfuscate, you know. Don't let his generalization of the term fintech cloud your vision on what this topic's really about. It's not just fintech as a whole, it's blockchain primarily, especially within the terms of all discussions that will be had at this blockchain and banks panel, right? Now, what he's also said is that, you know, these this is why it's so important for the IMF to understand this fintech space, because these banks and financial institutions and governments are turning to the IMF for guidance, right? So who did this IMF? Now, we're going to go through this real quick before, you know, because I want people to understand, you know, that these are human beings, right? And they're human beings who are in positions of professional authority. And so they being the very intelligent individuals they are, if they don't know something, do you know what they do? They don't pretend to know. No, they seek out an advisor who's a professional in that space. So who's a professional in the blockchain space that we know that the IMF regularly consults regarding fintech developments in the blockchain space? Oh, Brad Garlinghouse and Ripple. Okay. Do you see the importance of that? You're listening to me talk to you about this crypto thing, and now I don't have confidence absolutely in anything that I'm ever saying to you. That's why I'm, whenever I don't have confidence, I'm openly saying, hey, I don't know, this is speculation. As most of what I am stringing together for you can be construed as speculation, but I'm rooting this in a narrative of human psychology and how people in power operate to ensure that they don't lose power by operating as conscientious, and objective entities within their environment, right? These individuals don't have the luxury to be the emotionally wild and crazy and spontaneous individuals that many outside of the professional world have the luxury to enjoy, right? At least not for the most of their lives. Most of their life is spent in these very stuffy professional roles, and so they have to be rather rigid and objective, right? Anyways, I've gone on enough of a tangent explaining why it's so important to you that Ripple and Ross, or why Brad and Ross are having this conversation. And this conversation, I believe, happened in January, maybe December. Let's see if it says in the video here. November. This happened at the end of November. So, yeah, there you go. Let's hop back into this and hear what Ross has to say in regards to how the IMF is approaching aiding these banks, right?
So right now, the IMF is doing a lot of work in this space, and it consists of several different initiatives. First of all, we have a very active program of research and publication. We published major studies on what were then called virtual currencies, aka crypto assets, and on the potential impact of fintech on the cross-border payments market. We are engaging very closely with the private sector and the industry, and last year put in place a high-level advisory group of industry leaders from the private and public sectors to help guide us in our work on fintech. I'm very happy to say that Chris Larsen, one of the co-founders of Ripple, and Sapnendo Mohante from the Monetary Authority of Singapore are both part of that group, and we're very grateful for the advice that they give us. And thirdly,
and again, there you go. Chris Larsen is on their board of advisors for this space, right? Chris Larsen, one of the founders and developers of XRP, one of the biggest holders of XRP. Do you really think that he doesn't have the best hopes and interests for something that could potentially make him one day the most wealthy individual on the planet? Maybe. I don't know. Anyways, keep going, Ross. Loving it, boss. Thank you for showing everybody just how deep these roots go.
We're engaging very actively with our member countries, using our convening power to bring them together to discuss experiences in unlocking the potential of fintech and blockchain, but also in beginning to design regulatory frameworks that help mitigate the potential risks. And in particular, given the demand for advice in this area, at our annual meetings at Bali last month, we and the World Bank jointly launched an initiative called the Bali FinTech Agenda, which we think is the first comprehensive framework of issues that countries need to think about when designing policy around fintech. And this will be an anchor for much of our work going forward. So Brad, maybe I can ask you now, from your perspective in the private sector, what's going on right now in the ASEAN countries? And in particular, what are the specific challenges and opportunities that blockchain presents for them?
So before Brad answers his question regarding what blockchain can do for the ASEAN Pacific nations, as he refers to them, let's talk a little bit about his. Oh, I just spaced his notion here. What was he literally just talking about before his question? Oh no.
Demand for
Apologies.
advice in this area at our annual meetings at Bali.
Oh yes. The Bali. Apologies for having to jump back there, but the Bali Accord is agreement. We're gonna have a look at in a future video. Also, I'm gonna mark that down literally right now, because he just said that their future plans, which are the plans that we are seeing being set in motion right now, are going to be heavily rooted in what was drawn up in Bali, right? So I'm going to take the action to get into the root of that if I can, as soon as I can, to really tear that apart for everybody. So just so you know, that will be some future content now. But let's jump back into this and hear what Brad has to say in regards to what blockchain offers the Asiatic nations.
In particular, what are the specific challenges and opportunities that blockchain presents for them?
Sounds good. I'll start by saying I want to know how I get invited to the IMF annual meeting in Bali, because that sounds pretty good. So, there are a number of unique things going on in ASEAN countries that I think are worth calling out. And I think really the reason why Ross and I are up here together in some ways is, I think first and foremost is regulatory clarity has a huge impact on the ability to drive blockchain and digital asset adoption. And I think, we're here in Singapore. Singapore certainly is one country that has done a lot to be a leader in this space, and that regulatory clarity has enabled the market to invest in it with clarity. Thailand would be another country that we've seen that has expressly and explicitly legalized and endorsed digital assets, including XRP. We've seen some of that same activity in the Philippines. And so the first dynamic that I think has impacted blockchain adoption across ASEAN markets, and certainly for Ripple, is regulatory clarity. And that remains important. And frankly, it's surprising to me how many markets you still have a lot of uncertainty. There's no doubt in my mind that you're seeing real use cases where you're solving real problems for customers. And if we can have that regulatory certainty, and I'm talking about for Ripple, but I'm also talking about for other companies in this space also, the more quickly we can see adoption of those technologies. So the first dynamic, I think, is on regulatory clarity. The second dynamic is, this is a market where the ASEAN countries have over 100 billion, almost 130 billion dollars of inbound remittances. And so when you have that type of volume of remittances, and that remittances, as many people in this audience know, are often the most expensive taxed through the costs and friction of cross-border payments today. And so it's a market that's ripe for adoption to take advantage of blockchain technologies, certainly Ripple's technology, and driving those costs dramatically lower. The third dynamic that's actually interesting to see unfold here in the ASEAN markets is, in some ways, the current kind of SWIFT-enabled correspondent banking is leaving some of the ASEAN markets behind. As banks have contracted their correspondent banking relationships, some markets, whether it's Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, have actually seen their correspondent banking relationships contract, which is a problem for these economies in these markets. And so it's made this ASEAN market, I think, a ripe market for adoption of blockchain technologies and digital assets. Ripple now sees 50% of all of our global customers here in the Asian markets, and so it's been a very ripe ripe group for us. Our Singapore office has grown dramatically, about 200% in the last year, and we see that continue to grow through the course of next year.
So, to summarize, and I'm only going to summarize Brad's words here. What's going on with blockchain in Asia? ASEAN nations, as they keep saying. That's such a weird term. I've never heard him referred to as that. But anyways, to summarize what he's saying, what's going on? Well, the Asian nations are rapidly adopting blockchain regulation. And actually, interestingly, just one little side note, he mentioned SCB, or not SCB, but Thailand being like one of the primary examples of an area that's heavily, or that's actually endorsing regulation and embracing Ripple in their XRP token. So it's kind of strange that we're seeing SCB play the way they are. I'm assuming, based on my video I just recently did, that means that they're just under an NDA, and so it's like, hush, hush, no, we're not, shh, stop, we're not ready to announce this yet, stop it, no, it needs some time. Anyways, so The first is regulation. Asian nations are regulating this space much quicker than anywhere else, and thus it's allowing for this blockchain revolution to really bloom from there, right? The second notion is that it's enabling many of these poorer nations to have access to cheap remittances, which is not just saving the people money, but also the financial institutions money. So it's a cost benefit to adopting Ripple's platform, at least, as he said. And then his third point is growth in that the current banking system, because it's expensive to maintain branches and offices in these different regions, it's what the blockchain technology is bringing in, the fact that all that you have to do is give somebody access to power and the ability to have an access to a smartphone and Wi-Fi. There you go. They're connected to a bank, the RippleNet, right? And so it fosters growth in regions where growth is hard for banks to access right now because of the cost of maintaining facilities in those regions. So those are his 3 points. Let's hear what he's got for Ross now.
Back over to you, Ross. So, as the regulatory expert, what are the characteristics of ASEAN that you think will either propel this region forward in regards to blockchain or stifle its path?
Really hard question. First of all, I have to say that when you discuss legal and regulatory frameworks around blockchain or fintech globally, not just here in the ASEAN countries, we're at a very early stage of the conversation, and a lot more work needs to be done. And I think it's also important to note that when you talk about the ASEAN countries, you're talking about a very diverse group of countries at different levels of development, in different circumstances, and with different needs. And against that background, it's not surprising that some are perhaps further ahead than others in thinking through policy in the area of blockchain and fintech. And it's not surprising that some of them have taken different regulatory approaches. You mentioned crypto assets, where some countries have put in place regulatory frameworks, whereas others have banned them. But against that background, I think a few important points can be made. The first is, I think there's a general openness amongst many countries in the region to embrace the potential of fintech and think about policy that will allow innovation to happen. Secondly, I think there's a general willingness amongst many of these countries to engage with the private sector, to understand the technologies and the business products and services they're developing, but also to help the private sector understand the regulatory concerns that they raise. I think it's been said that fintech firms in this region are perhaps more willing than their counterparts in other jurisdictions to engage with regulators at a relatively early stage of product development. But I think the most useful example of this process consists of the regulatory sandboxes that countries in the region have put in place, including Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia. These basically serve two purposes. They first allow new products and services to be tested in a controlled environment, but they also enable regulators to understand the new products and services in ways that will inform regulation in future. I think another important,
So before he goes on to this other point, I just want to recap on what he's essentially said really in sort of a concise way. So he entered by saying, well, this doesn't just apply to Asia, what I'm about to say, but to the whole world. So what applies to the whole world? Well, Asia has been, really supportive of this new wave of innovation. They've come, they've worked actively with the private sector, aka blockchain companies like Ripple, the blockchain-based companies like Ripple. They're building upon a blockchain currency. Pardon me. So it's really important that Asian nations are engaging like this, right? That's positive. And what else is positive is that these private groups, it's not just that these governments are engaging with the private industry, but also that the private industry is engaging with the governments, right? So they're actively working to make sure that they are adhering to what the governments in those regions are saying that you need to do this, that, and the other in this space for us to allow you here. And those companies are saying, okay, we're doing this, that, and the other to make sure that we can stay here and continue to promote our whatever our native asset is, right? So, with that said, let's listen to his next points.
Feature, if you will, or point that can be made is that in cases where countries have seen potential use cases that will actually help the population and the financial system, they've been willing to put in place regulation to enable those use cases to go ahead. A good example of this is the cross-border remittance market, with the use of crypto assets as a rail to transfer currency across borders, where this obviously is a very important issue in this region. You have countries like the Philippines and Thailand putting in place regulation around crypto exchanges that address regulatory concerns, including money laundering and terrorist financing concerns, that allow this use case to develop. Thailand, I know, has also put in place guidance around blockchain technologies more generally, and I think these are important developments. I think it's also true that regulators in the region have demonstrated a willingness to engage with each other and also with their counterparts in other parts of the world. Some of the countries in the region are part of the UK's Global Sandbox initiative, and also developments like the Financial Innovation Network here are an excellent example of cross-border cooperation in ways that involve different stakeholders in the process in developing solutions to problems.
So let's review that chunk too. He's got quite a bit to share on this point. So I'm gonna work in reverse engineer this. So he was just speaking about the fact that what's so great about this area, right? Why this is going so well, why this blockchain revolution is doing so much good for them, is because the regulators are not only creating regulation, which was the first little bit, right? So they're actively working with the blockchain companies are actively working with them. They do that cooperation, creates regulations that both parties can agree on. Those regulations are then adopted and implemented, but those regulations are then debated between nations in the region, right? They're coming together and saying, okay, we butt heads on these positions, so we got to find a resolution, because if not, then obviously our ecosystem that we're both working on is going to have issues. So what can we come to agreements on? What is our conflicts, and what ways can we resolve them? And what he elaborated on further than that is that it's not just the nations in these regions, but nations around the global community. And he alluded to the fact that these Asian nations are working with the European central banks, the European institutions, which isn't that so ironic that just, that we've been breaking down all this news regarding what's going on in Japan and Asia and Europe at large, right? So these regions are both working close together, and we've also constantly talked about the fact that Saudi Arabia and the Middle East are now networking into this system too. So it's blowing up quick, is the big point. Now, let's jump back into this now that we've got that whole spiel, last 2 minutes confined. I want to try and get the first 15 minutes of this in, so we're going to listen to the end of that, and then we'll break down everything that was said there.
And finally, perhaps 2 more points, is I think there's also a recognition, particularly here in Singapore, about in designing policy around fintech, it can't be looked at in a vacuum. It has to be a part of a broader conversation and strategy about digitization in the economy as a whole. And then finally, I think we all have to recognize, as I say, that we're still at an early stage in many areas, and certainly in this region, as is the case in others, there's still many gaps that have to be filled and inconsistencies across jurisdictions. And in particular, one should not underestimate, particularly when talking about blockchain, the importance of the legal framework. And it's true, I think, around the world that there are many features of the legal framework particularly as they apply to payments and cross-border payments that weren't designed for blockchain. And it will be important for jurisdictions to think through these problems and to consider amendments to legal frameworks that will accommodate the specific features of blockchain. So Brad, maybe it's my turn to ask you a question now.
All right.
You know, it's, I think, particularly appropriate to be here in Singapore talking about blockchain and innovation in the blockchain space because, you know, countries in this region have, I think, been open to these technologies in ways that have helped them leapfrog their counterparts in other parts of the world in many different areas. But, you know, drilling down on a use case, Brad, you know, I think I mentioned remittances. But, you know, from your perspective, what do you see as a really good use case for blockchain in this region? You know, and how can technology address problems?
So before Brad answers, that's just me setting you guys up for our next video. And I'm probably actually going to do this in 3 parts now that I'm thinking about it, because I'm going to do the next section and then the QA. Now, I also want everybody to be focused on tuning into the Q&A, because the Q&A is what made this particular speech monumental in XRP's history, at least amongst the hype machine back in November, and it helped fuel into the 589 movement. It's one of the big things that made everybody stop and think for a minute, wait, is there something to this bearable guy? Right? This is one of the big things that really got a lot of people going. So we're going to break that down. I apologize for the dogs. Suddenly, I'm assuming somebody must be here. So I'm going to wrap this up. His last few points that he pointed out to before we do was the fact that the IMF, it was further touching upon what we touched. He alluded to in his previous, and that I kind of broke down, that, you know, this is that the reason these areas are doing so well is because they are actively implementing regulations specifically designed around blockchain, which are which the current regulatory system, as he also said, is not currently built to be accommodating or inclusive to, due to how different these blockchain crypto assets are from traditional assets, right? They just don't sit neatly in the same box as all the other asset groups, so they need to be regulated as their own entity, and that is why the Asian nations are seeing so much adoption, or such rapid adoption and this blockchain ecosystem flourishing there, because they are approaching it in this manner. And it is an example to the rest of the global community as to how this ecosystem needs to be regulated, right? So, with that said, I hope you've enjoyed this part 1 of a deep dive into blockchain and banks. I hope you'll be ready with that bell rung, so that you are going to be there in the live premiere stream to chat about what's going on in this panel in the second video, where we're going to finish off their discussions, and then we can all hype about what's actually going to happen between those of us who know and those who don't know about what comes from the Q&A of this discussion that these two are having right now, right? So, with that said, as always, I've been Jade Martian. Please hit that like. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe. And once again, ring that bell so that you can tune in for part 2 of this deep dive series. I can't wait to see all of you, my XRP Martians, in the next video on Mars.